Welcome to Tony Martignetti Nonprofit Radio coverage of Fundraising Day 2013. We're in Midtown Manhattan in Times Square at the Marriott Marquis Hotel, and my guest now is Sarah Durham. She is principal and founder of Big Duck, and her seminar topic is Brandraise To Fundraise. Build your house before you throw a party. Sarah Durham, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Tell me about the Big Duck agency.
So I started Big Duck in 1994, and so we're 19 years old. We work exclusively with nonprofits to help them communicate more effectively.
I love the conciseness. Thank you.
Thank you.
What is brand raising?
Brand raising is a model we've developed over many, many years of working with nonprofits to help them rebrand, largely in order to be more effective at communicating with donors, clients, and other key constituents. And it's a model that integrates some best practices from the for-profit world with some nonprofit realities, like where should the board be involved in branding, or how does your vision, mission, and values integrate into the work? So
we do recognize that there are lessons to be learned from the corporate side.
There definitely are, although I would say that many a nonprofit, I don't think you can be too black and white about that. I think there are lots of great lessons to learn from the for-profit world, but what works in the for-profit world does not always work in the nonprofit world, and so, you know, that's the challenge.
Oh, for sure, yeah. All right, how do we get started with identifying our brand and starting this process?
Well, a lot of organizations usually back into thinking about their brand because there's another challenge that has forced them to deal with it. So, for instance, they want to overhaul their website, and they're thinking, before we overhaul that website, we should really sort out, you know, the problems we have with our name or the challenge with our logo. And so they kind of end up, you know, sort of through the side door getting into branding. But we are big advocates for rethinking your brand anytime you go through a significant change after strategic planning. So strategic planning should come first, but then if your strategic plan mandates a shift in communications, that's a really good time to revisit the brand.
All right. Now, brand is much deeper than just logo and name and tagline, right?
Absolutely.
Help us understand how what the depth is.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would argue that your brand begins with a clear strategy that everybody in the organization is aligned with. What's the big idea you want to communicate? We call that positioning.
There's your strategic plan. Comes first.
Grows right out of your strategic plan. And then also, what is the personality of the organization? What tone and style does it want to use to communicate? For instance, an organization like PETA has a very different communications personality than the ASPCA, right? And that personality can influence not only communications, but programs themselves.
Okay.
The other piece I would say about a brand is that it's not just what the organization produces, it's also how you're perceived externally and your reputation. So there's a very fluid wall between what happens inside and what happens outside. And
how do we find out how we're perceived outside?
You really have to do some research, and sometimes that research is done in a very on-the-fly. I've seen organizations do great kind of on-the-fly qualitative research. They just talk to their clients, talk to their donors, really kind of have a feeling for how they're perceived. Other organizations, it's done through market research, you know, focus groups, surveys, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so it doesn't have to be a formal process.
No.
With a lot of money and expensive.
Not at all, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book Brand Raising, is that none of this is rocket science. It's pretty easy to do. The hardest part is knowing what to do and facilitating a process, particularly with nonprofits that have the right people involved and has buy-in at key junctures. So, but doing research is pretty easy to do on your own. In fact, I talk about it in the book, and I years ago recorded a podcast about how to do your own research.
Okay, well, let's take one at a time. I was going to give you a shout out for the book at the end.
Great.
But go ahead, you mentioned it. So what is the name of your book?
The book is called Brand Raising, and it came out in 2010, published by Josie Bass.
Okay, and your podcast, what was that called?
The podcast is kind of, you can find it on iTunes and other places, but we don't keep it up to date. It's called The Nonprofit Jungle, and we did one about doing your own research, which is about how you create a facilitator's guide and facilitate informal focus groups. You can also just use tools like Survey Gizmo and SurveyMonkey to do some interesting research if you have a list to send it to.
Oh, interesting. All right, say a little more about that. How can we use these free tools?
Well, so for instance, if you've got, let's say you've got a donor database of a few thousand people who give to you at a mid-level, and those people also get your e-news, you might embed a survey in your e-news and ask them just 2 or 3 questions that might help, help get a sense of what they think about your organization or why they're connected. And that often informs the branding work you do, but oftentimes with branding, it's also really useful to go back to that group and to test. So if, for instance, we're rebranding a nonprofit, we might create 2 different brochures and then informally walk into a program space and grab a couple clients and say, here's 2 different brochures. Does one speak to you more than the other? Or is there anything that you would find inappropriate or offensive about this content? You can do that with donors too, but that kind of field testing is often a great form of research.
Okay, excellent. And this is all about having people understand and having a consistent message about what you do, how you do it, what the outcomes are.
Absolutely. I often remind people in the nonprofit sector that if you look at big for-profit companies like Coca-Cola or Target or Starbucks, they have much more money and a much deeper bench of staff than most nonprofits do to communicate. But yet you don't see them change their color, change the logo. I had a conversation with somebody here earlier about wanting to create an anniversary year logo, which I was advising her not to do, because you want every type of communication you put out there to reinforce the essence of who your organization is. And I would rather that all ladder up to the core rather than being fractured. If Tiffany every few years said, you know what, let's make the box pink this year, they would lose the equity of that blue box, which is, a core to their brand. But we do that all the time in the nonprofit world, and it's a bad habit.
It is, okay. So what is how would you define an effective brand?
An effective brand is one where the people internally feel connected to it, representative of it, and ambassadors of it, where everybody in the organization, whether they're a staff person, a board person, maybe even a volunteer, could speak in some way about the work and its value, and that it's perceived externally by its core audiences as valuable too. So it's both internal and external, and I actually think it has a lot to do with the culture and the values of the organization being, authentic and alive, and the visual identity or the messaging is really just an expression of that.
And I can see how this would certainly help fundraising, but you can articulate it better than I can. So
yeah,
let's make that connection.
Well, it does have a lot of impact on fundraising, and one of the most significant impacts we're seeing most recently is around social media and the idea that if you're going to push out a fundraising message or you're going to do a multi-channel campaign, which more and more organizations are doing, those people are not just going to get your email or your direct mail, but they're going to visit your website, they're going to be on Facebook, they're going to go to Twitter, and we want all of those messages to really ladder up and reinforce the essence of what the organization's about and what the campaign is about. So that's a lot of what I'm talking about here at Fundraising Day.
This is by the way, for those who are on the video, the background just shook. There's not an earthquake in Times Square. It's just somebody on the other side, I'm sure, got very exuberant about whatever their business is on the other side and is shaking. So no earthquake in Times Square. This is, I guess, another way of saying this is all effective communications.
Absolutely.
And it needs to be resonant throughout the organization. I mean, you mentioned even down to the level of volunteers, and you're not talking about key volunteers, but occasional volunteers.
No, I mean, I think if an organization uses volunteers and they recruit them effectively and those volunteers have a great experience, the first thing they do is go out and tell their friends about it. So they become brand ambassadors. That's not to say we should train them on the brand per se, but it is that we should make sure they have an experience that is really aware of that and use that to our advantage. I used in my workshop this morning an example from an organization called American Jewish World Service that has a program for rabbinical students. And when you look at how they communicate this program on their website, they actually tell you that if you go on this program, you're going to be asked when you come back to do some fundraising on behalf of it. And on the program, you're getting sort of trained to do that work. And then when you come back, they give you the tools to do that work. So that's a great example of an organization using a program's audience and kind of turning them into a brand ambassador.
You have a very vivid example before of PETA versus the American Humane Society and different messaging. How does an organization find its niche within all the organizations that are doing work within that same mission? Right.
Well, again, that starts with research. And one of the things that I think is very important to do is to do a competitive landscape scan. So you have to know who else is out there.
I have Jargon Jail on Tony Martin's Nonprofit Radio. So competitive First, we're competitive landscape scan.
Yep.
What are we doing? What the heck is that?
What we're doing is we're identifying our peers, our partners, people.
I hate jargon, by the way.
People, I'm with you too. In fact,
figured you would be.
In fact, we every year we do like a jargon article on our blog, and we have words to avoid for each year. But so for instance, if you're in the animal rights space, who else is in that space? What are their websites? How do they communicate? What are the key messages they're using? What are the colors they're using? How are they describing how they're unique? And I think it's really important to always be monitoring that, always be aware of how other organizations in your space are communicating. That's not to say that if they use blue, you're going to use pink, or that it's that kind of direct, but it is to say that it's important to remember that people on the outside might be looking at those things. A donor who wants to support animal rights might look at lots of different animal rights organizations' websites, and you need to be clear how you stand out in that space. It also, again, goes back to strategic planning, right? Because hopefully in the strategic planning process, you've also had a conversation about what really makes our organization unique and what should we be focusing on programmatically.
Is this something that a small and mid-sized shop can do on their own?
Absolutely.
You don't feel that there's a need for expertise to do these kinds of competitive landscape analyses or other things?
I mean, the difference between the smaller guys and the bigger guys comes down basically to two things. The bigger guys can afford to hire experts who take them through a process, and that certainly is nice. But what the small guys have that the big guys lack is agility. And I've seen some smaller organizations with staff people or with volunteers go through some really exciting, strategic planning and branding processes on their own. Sometimes it takes longer and there's more learning that has to happen on the way. It really needs a champion. It needs somebody who's, able to kind of take the work, run with it, make it their own, and keep it alive. But it can be done really well.
Okay. Could that person be the executive director?
Absolutely.
Or is that
Yeah. In fact, I was in Florida a couple of years ago, and I was giving a workshop, and I met a woman who was an executive director, one-man band, no staff, just her, and she had been able to recruit volunteers, develop an incredible visual identity and messaging platform for her organization. She was producing all this stuff to promote it. It was great. What she was doing looked better than what a lot of large organizations I see do, and it was really about her vision. It was that she understood what effective communication should be, and she wasn't letting herself off the hook by saying, I'm just one person. She garnered these resources she needed to make it happen. It was amazing.
And we're talking about personality, right? I mean, isn't that just another way of encapsulating everything we're talking about?
Definitely.
She found the personality and was expressing it.
And she knew how to enforce it. And I mean, there are organizations that really get that, executive directors who really get that, who appreciate the value of great creative. And then I think one of the reasons it doesn't happen most often is that there are a lot of organizations where the programmatic work is so important as it's founded, and everybody's just putting every effort that they have into getting those programs up and running, that the name, the logo, the tagline, how we talk about the work, etc., becomes an afterthought. And oftentimes it's only 5 years, 10 years, 25 years in that the organization starts to say, wait, these things are actually holding us back. We need to, reprioritize.
You mentioned something that I want to explore a little more, enforcement. We've been through this process. Now we've found our niche and we're expressing it. How do we keep it enforced?
Yeah, I mean, the old model is brand policing. So that's appointing a person who really, is somewhat of a bully about keeping things consistent and on track.
Is that the person who would write the style guide, for instance?
It might be.
Okay.
But these days, what I really prefer and what I would really encourage organizations to do, because I think it's much more relevant, is to cultivate everybody to be a brand ambassador, right? I mean, if a staff person, any staff person, can't go to the gala or to a block party or to whatever is going on and talk effectively about the organization, that's a problem, right? So everybody needs to be able to be an ambassador for the organization in whatever way they can. And in order to make that work, it has to be the communications have to be very, very simple, and they have to be very accessible to everybody on staff. So you mentioned a style guide. Style guides are getting more and more common in the nonprofit sector. A style guide historically has been a rule book for how to use the visual identity. I actually prefer a brand guide, which talks more about the communication strategy for the organization and the messaging. Like, here's how you abbreviate our name. Don't use the acronym, to go back to jargon.
Yeah.
Instead of, in the workshop I gave this morning, there was one woman whose organization goes by AIXY, blah, 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 long acronym. And when she unpacks it, it's an association. You know exactly what they do with the name. So it's a cumbersome name, but I'd rather she call it the association if she has to shorthand it. At least there's a clue who they are.
Okay. And this trickles down to, as I think you've made the point already, everybody in the organization. I mean, it really doesn't. Your function may be very ministerial, down to maintenance, perhaps, but you still want to. You need to be speaking with that same organizational voice.
Absolutely. And if the maintenance person is on Facebook and might be posting something about an event that's going on that they were involved in helping, then you want them to feel empowered to be on message.
What else? What have I not asked you that you'd like to share with small and mid-size shops about this process, brand raising, how it helps supports fundraising?
Well, I would say one theme we've touched on, but I'd want to just say again is don't give up hope. Just because you're small and you can't afford to hire an agency or whatever, that doesn't mean you can't do a great job. When I wrote my book, I was trying very hard to write it from a point of view of, could somebody who doesn't do this stuff every day take this and use it? And I'm hearing back from people that they can, but I'm also seeing more and more examples of organizations just really coming up with fresh, creative ways to do it. We built this scorecard that we have on our website where you can go in and sort of answer a series of questions, and it reflects back to you how your organization is doing managing its communications. And one of the interesting findings we have uncovered from that is that the small guys do it just as well as the big guys. That the having staff people or money for communications does not necessarily make you a better communicator.
Excellent. The website is bigduck.com.
It's bigducknyc.com.
Big Duck. Okay. Ignore what I said first. Bigducknyc.com.
Yep.
Sarah Durham, you want to leave one last tip?
Come to Fundraising Day. It's a great show. I want to see you all here next year.
Okay. You'll be back.
I'll be back. I love it here. Yeah.
Sarah Durham is
Thanks, Tony.
principal. My pleasure. Thank you very much. Principal and founder of Big Duck here in NYC. Her book is Brand Raising. And I want to thank you very much for joining me, Sarah. And listeners, viewers, thank you for joining my coverage of Fundraising Day 2013, the Marriott Marquis Hotel. Thanks very much.
Thanks.